Welcome to the Katalis podcast. I'm your host, Sondang Sirait, Communications Advisor with Katalis.
Katalis is a unique 5-year government-backed business development program that unlocks the vast potential of economic partnerships between Australia and Indonesia.
Zero carbon by 2060. That's Indonesia's target and timeline in achieving net zero carbon emission. For a country that relies heavily on coal, that means there will need to be significant changes. Some businesses are starting to make the transition, with the government proactively encouraging more private investment. In this episode of the Katalis podcast, we ask what more needs to be done to slash emissions in Indonesia. We will also tap into the Australian experience of investing in clean energy. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to join in the conversation on social media and website at ayacepa-katalis.org. Central to the race to zero carbon is the role played by the private sector. Some major companies are slowly making the transition away from coal and into the renewable energy sector. One Australian company is leading the way through its focus on green hydrogen. Joining us now is the Indonesia Country Manager for Fortescue Future Industries, Enda Ginting. Bang Enda, thanks for joining us on the Catalyst podcast.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
Your company holds a prominent role in developing renewable energy resources. It's a well-known company in the industry globally. Tell us what brought you to Indonesia and how do you see your company responding to and supporting the government's call for transitioning to green energy?
Very interesting question. Very good one. First of all, I myself am Indonesian. Fortescue Future Industries came out of the parent company, Fortescue Metal Group, after there was a proof of concept that actually worked in using large-scale green hydrogen and green ammonia to decarbonize the parent company. The chairman, the founder, Andrew Forrest, then saw this as an opportunity to speed up the global energy transition process so that we actually can achieve the threshold of the 2 degrees increase in global temperature. The way I look at it, I think green hydrogen allows a much more decentralized access and control over energy, as opposed to the conventional fossil fuel method of control, where only certain countries, certain geographies are privileged of being able to produce large-scale fossil fuel and therefore pump their economy.
Why focus on green hydrogen?
The beauty of green hydrogen is that every country that has any source of renewable energy, be it solar, and I'm sure there's sun everywhere, wind, geothermal, and hydro, will have the chance to produce it. So this is, in a way I look at it as helping the global transition, but more importantly, allowing a new change in how global energy management. I think if you take a look at the energy industry, it's one of the most transparent industries globally. We know roughly how much each country produces, how much they use, and how the trade works. I say relatively because if you compare to other industries, which are much more closed and not as transparent as energy. So I think the step the company took was very great. The way we look at it is Indonesia has huge potentials to be able to be producing green hydrogen. When I say producing, it's not just for its own export, but also for its own domestic use. But more importantly, as globally, countries across the world, mainly in developing countries, but also developed countries, also are now beginning to produce green hydrogen. There is an important question that countries like Indonesia face, which is when Indonesia starts producing green hydrogen, what role does it want to take in the global trade? If we compare to fossil fuel, there's net producers, net importers, and countries who actually get to say how much influence they have over the global trade. And this is where I think we need to look at the green hydrogen production from that perspective. Producing it is one thing, producing it to a level that allows all the fossil fuel industries to be assured that there's sufficient enough of hydrogen, green hydrogen around to allow them to transition in an economic manner is another thing. And then producing it to a scope and level where a nation could say, well, I am producing very large scale, therefore I am entitled to influence the early markets, the early global markets is another thing. And the level of sophistication differs, but I think it's always good and always important to aim high.
How do you see your work forward in working with different stakeholders in Indonesia?
So forward-looking, some authorities in different parts of the country, different parts of the world are much more progressive. They can immediately spot an opportunity and say, okay, we may not understand this, but I think this is important and we'll jump on it. We'll provide the support what we can, and that may be minimum, that may be maximum. Some authorities may not even yet understand and probably look at it as just a molecule, and that's quite normal. Because in terms of the vocabulary of the renewable energy, green hydrogen shouldn't be new, but unfortunately it is new. And we realize that there's a lot of efforts to make it sound like it's an alternative energy. No, it's not. It should be the main energy. It's a future energy. No, it's today's energy, because we need to address climate change now from energy transition and carbon emission. So there is a lot of opportunities if one has an open mind and heart to say, I will slowly witness how this transition takes place and jump in at the next opportunity, as opposed to I will use the past algorithms to forecast and estimate. It's great to be part of the Fortescue family and across the global operations. I meet different colleagues from other parts of the world. And when we meet, it shows the diversity. And in fact, Fortescue Future Industries Indonesia, our operations has also very diverse members. We actually have members from all the major islands in Indonesia. So that's important to keep note, because as we want to do things, we want to do it the future way, not how the 70s and the 60s or the 50s did it. There's some important lessons there, but we need to be relevant. And it's easier being relevant the way Fortescue does it, because it does allow and welcome these initiatives, not just as a corporate slogan. So, yeah.
What observations do you have in terms of the regulatory context?
I think if we were to suggest to the authorities how would Indonesia be able to produce such novel energy in such large scale, it will be a straightforward, easy set up a policy that prioritizes the use of green electrons to produce green hydrogen, as opposed to, because if you take a look at it, some of the business processes to acquire hydropower is different to geothermal. You have different levels of sophistication. So, for instance, there's around 97 permits required to acquire hydropower. Now, all of these are not interrelated at the first stage. So essentially, someone with the first stage permit can just land bank and then say, well, we're going to hold the land so that no other developers can come in. And basically, that's 30 million rupiah blocking 15 or 20 billion dollars worth of investment. But more importantly, the investment that globally Indonesia needs, which is the production of green hydrogen. So there's one thing I don't wish to criticize, but I would wish that there's a ramp up in policy that actually allows and supports the production of green hydrogen as a priority, rather than using these green electrons to fuel polluting companies. We actually focus on usage of green electrons to produce something that is of a future, quote unquote, future fuel, future energy. This is what I think the policy context and suggestion I could make in the Indonesian context. I'm sure every authority globally would have a very different approach in, for instance, permitting and processing for hydropowers or geothermal. But if we put it into perspective, there is a question every authority and every cabinet is asked: how would you like the green electrons to be used? Do you want it to fuel an energy that you need to help your country transition? Or do you want to just produce electrons and actually not prioritize how the electrons are used? I mean, you can fuel it, you can use it to sell power to a different country, you can still use the electrons to fire the next factory, which is great. Or you can say, how do we prioritize this transition? And these are the policies needed to adjust to make sure that we are upfront, we are in the top point of making sure all of our renewable energy resources are producing green hydrogen. That's a very long answer, but I was just trying to make sure that there's the context to it.
Bang Enda Ginting, thanks for being on the Katalis podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Setting Indonesia or any country on a path to achieve net zero requires investments and policies that match the scale of its ambition. Here is Indonesian Energy and Mineral Resources Minister Arifin Tasrif.
Strategi utama yang akan dilakukan antara lain, pertama, pengembangan energi baru terbarukan secara masif. Kedua, retirement, pembangkit listrik tenaga fosil yang dilakukan secara bertahap sesuai dengan umur pembangkit.
The first strategy, according to the minister, is to pursue massive development of renewable energy. Second, to retire fossil fuel-powered electricity plants. Third, to optimize energy storage technology. Fourth, to begin utilizing nuclear energy in 2045 with the goal to reach a capacity of 35 gigawatts by 2060. Fifth, develop interconnectivity and better implementation of smart grids and meters. Sixth, to implement clean energy by shifting cooking technology from LPG to electric and developing a pipeline network to supply natural gas to households. Sales of conventional motorcycles will be banned by 2040 and conventional cars by 2050 as the government encourages a wider use of green public transportation. Those in the race know that it takes more than a commitment to meet the target of net zero climate pollution. Let's bring in our next speaker, who is actively involved in advocating government and business action for climate and nature. Tim Cronin, Acting Head, Healthy Land and Seascapes at WWF Australia. Hi, Tim. Thanks for joining us on the Katalis podcast.
No problem. Good to be here.
There's this notion that demonizes the fossil fuel industry. At the same time, some policymakers are saying they want to be realistic, that we will continue to rely on some sort of combination of resources, because essentially what we all want is more resilient grids, lower electricity prices, cost-effective emissions reductions. What is your opinion?
Look, I think we need to do everything we can to decarbonise as quickly as possible, and that fundamentally means transitioning away from fossil fuels. There are areas that can do it faster and more efficiently than others, and there are some areas where it's likely we're gonna have some degree of carbon emissions forever. You know, this is why we're not looking at zero emission targets by 2050 or beforehand. We're looking at net zero emission targets. We need to allow for some residual emissions, but you know, that term residual, you know, needs to be taken seriously. We need to do everything we possibly can to reduce emissions at source. And increasingly what I'm seeing, the technology is there. The technology is rapidly improving. The cost efficiency is rapidly improving. And, you know, we can't look at offset markets and, you know, and other ways to perpetuate business as usual.
One thing Australia and Indonesia share in common is that both our governments have set targets of net zero climate pollution. What is your reading on the Australian experience so far in balancing technology and political commitment?
Well, look, I mean, it's good to see that commitment going into Glasgow. And, you know, even 6 to 12 months ago, if many people had said that we'd be going to Glasgow with a net zero commitment, you know, many people wouldn't have believed it. So I think we've got to give that some credit. But, you know, the reality is we went there. You know, we adopted that target essentially kicking and screaming. You know, it was a political football. It was something that you know, most of the government was very, very reluctant. But ultimately, it's fair to say that it was unavoidable. You know, that's the direction the world is taking. That's the direction that economics and markets are taking. And, you know, as much as our political forces here in Australia have been opposed to it for many, many years, it got to the point where there was just no viable way to oppose it. So we went there, but by the time we had that target in place, last year, the world had moved on and we were several years behind. The debate in Glasgow was meant to be about how rapidly we can get there and how much we can do in the next 10 years. And unfortunately, we've been stubbornly stuck to 2030 targets that are simply not efficient. 2050 net zero is okay, but we really need to focus on the next decade because, every day we delay, it's going to make it harder, to keep things within reach of that target.
If we look at the progress Australia has made so far, government projections are showing you're on track to meet the 2030 targets, and much of that is due to changes in land use and massive adoption of rooftop solar. But certainly there's more to be done to meet the 2050 target of net zero.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to say we're on track for 2030 targets, but when those 2030 targets are completely inadequate in order to make, a 2050 target and to meet the international commitment of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, then it's far from enough. We've made very little effort to decarbonise, to transition our fossil fuel industry at all. So a lot more needs to be done. You pointed to the land use figures, and that's important. We know that land-based emissions account for in the order of 20% of global emissions, and that's the case for Australia as much as anywhere. I think it's far higher for Indonesia. Much of the progress towards those targets, has linked to our land sector, which is good, but we also need to do a lot more in that space too. WWF listed Eastern Australia in its Global Deforestation Fronts report last year, following on from an earlier report. Australia is the only completely industrialised country on that list as a deforestation front. Is a terrible situation for us to be in. So we need to do a lot to reverse deforestation and really transition Australia from being a deforestation to a reforestation nation. And that in itself can do a huge amount in terms of emission reductions as well as emission removals through sequestration in forest restoration. If the entire economy needs to commit to a net zero pathway, then the land sector needs its own net zero pathway, not to be used as an offset for another sector. So we need to do a lot more. That 2050 target it's a good beacon, but we need to make sure that we're on the right pathway.
The WWF advocates for more investment in nature-based solutions. If you could tell us more about that and how these investments can create new jobs and generate revenue.
Sure. When we talk about nature-based solutions, it's a fairly broad term in this context. Let's look at it in the context of climate change. So nature-based solutions for climate change. There's really two ways we can look at that, in my view. One is nature can play a huge role in mitigating or reducing our emissions profile. The second thing that nature can do is to help us adapt to and withstand the greatest impacts of climate change. This is an acceptance that climate change is here. It's happening, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it every day. We saw it with our 2019-2020 bushfires. Australia at the time was really at the front line of climate change impacts. These things can be empirically linked back to climate change. So we need to accept that it's happening. We need to accept that even if the world does everything it possibly can right now, at best we will limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that is already going to have significant impacts on economies, on societies, and nature can really play an important role in helping us withstand those impacts. But at the same time, we can use nature to help address and slow down our emissions. I mean, the obvious example there is in carbon, and recognising that carbon these days is monetized through carbon markets. There's a role for carbon markets to play in enabling and incentivising communities, companies, governments to keep forests in the ground and to put more forests back in the ground. If we can establish and manage these carbon markets in the right way, it can be a very profound way to transform the economics of land use in such a way as to make it profitable to keep forests in the ground and not just valuable for the timber in the trees or the land on which they stand, which is traditionally how they've been seen. So carbon can play a really important role in shifting the economics of these things and fundamentally away from degradation and deforestation and towards conservation and sustainable management.
The race to zero begins with a single step. As we've heard from our speakers today, the pathways towards that goal could be through low-carbon innovation and renewable energy, reforestation and better land management, and many more. One thing for sure, it's time to act. And that's the end of this episode of the Katalis podcast. Hope this has given you a lot to think about. We invite you to join in the conversation on social media and our website at iachepa-katalis.org. I'll see you in our next episode.